Hey everybody, this is herculespetix, founder, curator, docent, and gift shop employee of the herculespetix Academy of Comic Book Studies. Today, we're going to be looking at Deepest Dimension #1. And this is a very odd comic. I almost can't believe this is real. The reason why is because the publisher of this 1993 comic, Revolutionary Comics, they were like probably one of the shittiest comic book publishers of all time. They did all of those unauthorized rock and roll comics and sports comics. They even had a porn star line of comics telling you the unauthorized biographies of all of these various people in entertainment and sports and porn. And they were just schlockmeisters of the highest degree, or lowest degree, I should say. They were just the only thing they published good out of like hundreds of titles. They actually picked up Dennis Warden's Stick Boy at one point, which was odd at the time. I guess Dennis Warden had no choice. Nobody else wanted him. So kudos to them for doing that. But this is even weirder because this is somehow Revolutionary Comics hooked up with classic Twilight Zone Star Trek author George Clayton Johnson. He wrote some of those most beloved stories from Twilight Zone classics, you know. He's a pretty well-respected guy. I think he wrote the script for Ocean's 11, which, to be honest, I've never seen that original movie. But it's, you know, people like it. It's kind of famous. So this guy is something. He's not just some 17-year-old kid with a modicum of talent, which is the usual class of people that Revolutionary Comics dealt with. They would just take advantage of all these young cartoonists because they were dumb and young and they wanted to get their name out there. They'd pay shit and it looked like it. You know, you get what you pay for. But I don't know how they teamed up with this guy who's kind of a name, and there is a clue. The one of the guys who adapts one of the stories in here, J. Allen Sanford, I think he worked for Revolutionary. He did a lot of comics for them. And he mentions that he's personal friends of George Clayton Johnson and his wife. So maybe it was just this thing of like, hey, buddy, why don't you do this crazy comic for this shitty little comic company? And George Clayton Johnson was like, sure. But the strange thing is that it's actually really good. I mean, Spain Rodriguez is in here, and Rick Geary, and they adapt a Robert Bloch story. I mean, this is a decent comic. I mean, don't let the cover fool you. This cover is utter shit. It's this guy named Derek Gross, and he did a lot of that in the 90s. Remember, painted art got really hot because of Alex Ross and Marvels, but a lot of these guys could barely draw, but they could paint. So it's like nephew art, you know? And if you're not familiar with nephew art, it's a coined by B. Claban, and it's the kind of art where someone's like, I need my van painted. And someone says, hey, I got a nephew in art school. He'll do it cheap. And once you learn that phrase, you'll never look at bad art again without thinking that term. That's my whole life, ever since I was a kid. When I see art like this, I'm like, that's nephew art. Thank you once again, B. Claban. So guys, that's why this comic blows my mind. It's so odd that Revolutionary Comics got such a stellar lineup for this. And I don't know if they paid extra. I don't know if these guys just wanted to work with George Clayton Johnson because of his name. I looked at the second issue, by the way, and it looks like typical shit Revolutionary Comics fodder. Like, I didn't recognize any of the names. I'm sure it's terrible, even though they adapt a Larry Niven story. But who knows? I could be wrong. But I don't feel the need to even look for that ever. But I'm glad I picked this up at a quarter bin years ago. We have a little introduction by George Clayton Johnson talking about how he's a lifelong comic book lover. And we start off with The Ring of Truth. This is adapted from a George Clayton Johnson story by J. Allen Sanford, and the art is by Spain Rodriguez. And you could tell, though, this is like work for hire, which I don't think Spain often did. It doesn't look like Spain's putting his all into this. Having said that, you know, half-assed Spain is pretty damn great. This still looks really good to me. George Clayton Johnson would often put himself in his stories. They always had a huge bit of autobiography in his stories. Then he'd go south and put in some weird shit. And that's what the story's like. Because George Clayton Johnson always looked like this. Even when he was an old man, he looked like a crazy hippie, like he'd be in the Manson family or something. So he's recalling this story about how he had writer's block. So he decided to get out of the house and, empty his brain for a little while and stop thinking about his book. And he finds himself at a Dead show. And he's at the this big parking lot before the show. And, it's like a tailgate party. People are selling stuff. It's almost like a bazaar, And then all of a sudden, this big guy, who's just dressed not like a hippie at all, walks right up to George Clayton Johnson, leans in, and says, "I used to be a serial killer." Of course, George Clayton Johnson doesn't know how to respond. He assumes he's one of those people who just like to bum out people tripping. There's assholes who'll do that. And then the guy says, "I gave it up, though." Of course, obviously, George Clayton Johnson's freaked out. And he's suddenly aware that he has no weapon on him. I love this panel here where he's thinking of questions he wants to ask the guy, but he doesn't really want to engage with him. Don't you believe in God and retribution? It's a great panel. We see like the end times. So this is definitely not this is harsh, it is mellow. Just thinking about this. And then the guy says, just to really twist the knife, he says, "I'm thinking of taking it up again." And George Clayton Johnson, the only reply he can come up with is, "Well, good luck with that." And then the guy walks off. He looks like he's disappointed in the fact that George Clayton Johnson doesn't seem afraid of him. And he's very happy that he loses all interest in him. And then we see a guy ODing, and people are helping him out. And George Clayton Johnson, he remembers how he just, when he was talking to that serial killer, he was forgetting to breathe. He was so panicked. So he goes up to the guy and just whispers to him, "Don't forget to breathe." And the guy seems better. He's like, "Oh yeah, I gotta breathe." And so George Clayton Johnson finds a bunch of his buddies, these two guys he knows from head shops, and he tells them the story of what just happened. One of them says, "Maybe you could put it in a story sometime." And George thinks to himself, the writer in me kicks himself, thinking of the lost opportunity, the questions he could have asked. And then he sees the guy again. He's watching George. And now he knows what he has to do. He's got to be a writer and get some info. And he basically reiterates what he said to him earlier. He says, "You used to be a serial killer. You gave it up. You used to follow Grateful Dead concerts. You're thinking of taking it up again." And so he asks him some questions. He says, "Aren't you afraid of the retribution of God?" And the serial killer says, "I am God." There was a movie in the 90s where the character says, "God, I am God." Like he says it all like that. And me and my girlfriend at the time used to always say that to each other. It would make us laugh. And so finally George asks him, "What do you get out of it?" And he says, "Gratitude. Humans are born into fear. They spend their lives running from death. When they finally realize that I've got them, that they're helpless and they can't get away. A look comes over them. They stop struggling. I've taken the decision out of their hands. That's pretty bleak. So then he gets up really close to George in a threatening way. But I guess George Clayton Johnson knows about pressure points, and he takes his pen and jams it at this one spot in between the rib cage. Is a deadly spot. And the guy goes down, wounded. I think he's mortally wounded. And when he looks in his eyes, he sees gratitude. And then he whispers to the guy, "Don't forget to breathe." And then he rolls him under a nearby truck and just walks away. And so he says, "Why am I telling you this?" And he says the reason why is because the writer in me thinks the story is too good not to write down. So I've never read any George Clayton Johnson stories. I did read Logan's Run. By the way, he co-wrote that book with William F. Nolan. I never knew that as a kid. And I read that book. It wasn't anything special. But I love the short story. If his short stories are often like this, where this really does make me question, did this really happen to George Clayton Johnson? I don't know. The way he mixes reality and fiction, it's very different than most writers. So I love this story. It's just really intriguing. Just the idea of a guy coming up to you and saying, I used to be a serial killer. Here we have a little introduction page for the next story by George. And look at this, guys. We get a new Rick Geary story. This is adapted from a short story by Robert Bloch, the great horror author, A Toy for Juliet. And we see Juliet. And she enters into her bed chambers. And something's a little off about this reality. It seems like it's definitely something sci-fi is going on. The mirrors in her room can do all these weird things that, mirrors can't do here. And behind every mirror is a closet, and she reviews what's behind every one. And they're all torture devices. Boot and thumb screws, the rack, and even an Iron Maiden. And she's thinking to herself about her grandfather. And she keeps thinking about, what toy will he bring me this time? I can't wait till he brings my new toy. Here's the grandfather. He'd shown her how to play with toys, I guess. And as you could probably tell, she's talking about human beings, and she tortures them. For some weird reason, her grandfather just brings her new toys to play with all the time. She grew up reading de Sade. So now we find out what's going on. There in the future, grandfather had brought the books from the past, just as he'd brought the playthings for her. He was a traveler. He has this time machine that just looks like a little shed. And he's really into old-timey stuff. So he just goes back, basically raids history for all this cool shit. Old VHSs, cool books. Because apparently the world now is just, it's gone through a nuclear holocaust. There's only 3,000 people left in the world, all living in these little bunkers. He liked to go to that part of the past before the thermonuclear wars and the robotic ages. He loved the olden times. Juliet says how her father actually built a time machine. And she suspects that grandfather killed her parents when she was a baby. Not that it mattered. Grandfather was always very good to her. So this is a very morally conflicted character, to say the least. And he tells her one day, he says, I've made you into a monster, and someday you'll end up destroying me. And then you'll destroy the entire world. That's my dream, the destruction of everything. Here we see those domes that the few humans are left surviving in. So she's reminiscing about her various toys. Her very first one was a little kid from the olden times. And she also has sex with them too. And this other kid. So, over the years, she's tortured and killed, I don't know, it sounds like hundreds of people. And apparently the grandfather knows history. So he takes the people she's met, the toys that she's had. When she reads history, she realizes they all disappeared. So people like Ambrose Bierce and Amelia Earhart. I don't know why Shakespeare's there. I don't think Shakespeare disappeared. Maybe there's a mystery about his death. I don't know. And just the way she thinks, she's a full-on evil, psychotic sadist. She loves this shit. So grandfather arrives from back in the past. And he says, I found you another, a toy. And this guy comes into her room. And he's from Victorian England, it looks like. He's very repressed. He blushes when he sees Juliet. Of course, he's confused as hell. He's like, who are you? Where am I? Usually she would toy with them for as long as she could, but she felt a strange urgency to just a savage need to just kill this guy pretty quick. She's got a knife under her pillow already. She says, come sit beside me on my bed. And, this guy thinks he's in heaven. He's like, am I dead? What's going on? She says, oh, you're closer to heaven than you think. And then she reaches under the pillow for the knife, and it's not there. Somehow it found its way into the toy's hand. And the toy wasn't prim and proper any longer. Its face was something glimpsed in a nightmare. It's a nice Rick Geary panel. Just a glimpse before the blinding blur of the knife. The room was soundproofed, so they didn't find Juliet's remains for several days. And back in London, after the final mysterious murder in the early morning hours, they never did find Jack the Ripper. So that's the twist. Her toy was Jack the Ripper. So the predator met an even stronger predator. Look at this gray page of the city. All the buildings are askew. God, Rick Geary is so good. Even though looks so great to me, I also think that Rick Geary, this is work for hire. And it's not the best Rick Geary. It's still fucking great. Usually Rick Geary has a little more backgrounds. It's nice stuff, though. Just having any Rick Geary story. I fucking love that guy. Okay, here's the continuation of that editorial from George Clayton Johnson. I guess he also wrote for Kung Fu, the TV show. Here's the back issues available from Revolutionary Comics. And it's just all shit. I mean, I flipped through a few of these back in the day. They used to sell these in record stores, and the art was just terrible. It was so crude. I'm sure maybe one of them, just by, the law of averages, was okay, probably. But for the most part, they were terrible. I don't know why kids bought this shit. But they're pretty popular, as you can tell by how many titles they had. If they didn't sell, they wouldn't have, kept making them. And then we have the back cover by Derek Gross. Another example of nephew art. That's not the worst. I'm being a little harsh, but it's not very good. Okay, guys, that's it for today's video. Deepest Dimension #1. You'll probably find this at a dollar bin somewhere, and you should pick it up. Spain and Rick Geary. It's very odd. Probably the only good thing Revolutionary Comics ever did other than Stick Boy, out of hundreds of titles. So, hope you liked watching today's video, and I hope to see you next time here at the Herculespetix Academy of Comic Book Studies.